Hello and welcome to the first of our 5 Halloween specials. These are a bit different to my normal content that focuses on snippets of local history, but it would feel wrong not to cover some extra paranormal themed tales of the area for Halloween. Rather than start with just a singular story, I have a collection of 3 that I hope you enjoy. We start in Sheringham, a small coastal village in North Norfolk, a village where for centuries the locals were fisher folk. They lived by the sea, and many of them died by the sea. This is where our first story comes in. That of an unexpected and almost supernatural storm force winds that churned the sea into a frenzy, claiming the life of any poor, unfortunate soul out to sea, only to stop as fast as they begin, locally known as the Yow Yows. The story goes that many years ago, on the night of a horrendous storm, a small cargo vessel was making its way along the coast when it found itself in distress. Now, the story often differs here whether it was a lone sailor on board or in fact a whole crew of men. But seeing the lights of Sheringham, they thought they were saved, and began to scream for help. But even though they could see people on shore watching them, and even people on their boats working, no help came. Soon the boat was overcome by water and sank. With his final breath, the ship's captain cursed the people of Sheringham, who refused to save them, instead letting them drown, in order to salvage and sell what was left of their cargo when the winds dropped. To make matters worse, the bodies of the sailors who washed up along Sheringham shores were not given a decent burial. Instead, they were dumped in a ditch near the Sheringham boundary and covered with stones to be forgotten. Ever since that day, it is reported that fishermen who are working on their boats will hear screaming coming from out to sea. A scream that, when followed, will lead to nothing, before starting again further and further out, only for the winds and waves to pick up, swamping the unfortunate sailor and sealing their doom. Once the storm hits, the disturbance move on to land, with those who are near the makeshift burial site hearing the sounds of shingle and stone moving, maybe the sound of the ditch being filled in all those years ago, or maybe the ghosts of the dead desperately trying to dig their way out. An interesting ghost story, it must be said, but it would not be right to not offer up a couple of explanations for what it might be for some of the more sceptical viewers. The tale, both the sea and the land sections, are a warning about going out in bad weather, aimed at younger fishermen who might think it's worth the risk going out in a storm or with a storm brewing in order to get an extra catch on their competitors. As well as many ghost stories, there is also the element of aiming at children to keep them in after dark and during bad weather. Strong winds that seem to come from nowhere and turn calm water into deadly waves is not exclusive to Sheringham. In fact, it's incredibly common around the world, from both Cape Horn and Good Hope to the Great Lakes between Canada and the USA. As for the screaming reportedly heard in the wind that leads further and further out, it is most likely a situation of the story perpetuating itself. That once you have been told about these screamings, people are more likely to be listening for them. Thus, the wind they hear is the screaming they hear is the wind, and so on. As for the noise from the crew's grave, this can simply be put down to stone and rock falling from the cliffs during wind and rain, unseen in the dark, and an area that should be avoided in such conditions. So, it is entirely possible that this story was either created or evolved to cover both the main dangers in the area. There being no date on when this boat was said to have sunk adds credence to this, as it always seems to be some vague time in the past, just out of living memory, with the story seeming to originate somewhere in the mid-19th century. Down the coast in Suffolk lays a small coastal village, hardly more than a single street long. Off the beaten path, it is easy to pass by, with little to no knowledge of its existence, but its name will strike a chord with any fan of the work of H.P. Lovecraft or the more unexplained areas you can explore in the Fallout video games, Dunwich. Much like in a story from H.P. Lovecraft himself, Dunwich was once a busy fishing town, recorded in the Doomsday Book as one of the largest in the country, only to be betrayed and destroyed by the very sea it relied on as a lifeline. Starting in the 13th century, the area was hit by huge ferocious storms, causing almost all of the town's houses, pubs, and even churches to fall into the waves as huge chunks of the land broke away and were carried out to sea, leaving just one lone gravestone behind it. With a background like this, it is little wonder that modern-day Dunwich is crawling with ghost stories and legends. Starting with what is left of All Saints' Church. This may be a bit of a stretch, but it has become part of local folklore. For a time in the 1800s, a villager became convinced, after reading an old book he found, that the remnants of the church's tower would fall into the sea at the end of the greatest war in history. The tower would fall in 1922, 4 years after the end of the First World War, and as the Russian Civil War, which had spilled out from it, was coming to an end. You may think of that what you will. The most famous of all the unexplained tales in this area is that of an object rather than a person. It is said, if you stand on the cliffs at the end of the main street that once marked the entrance to the now long gone town, when the wind blows in the right direction on a moonless night, you can hear the sounds of the church bells still ringing in the deep, cold waters, calling the residents to prayer. Divers who have explored the ruins in this dark, murky depths have reported they oftentimes do not feel alone down there. Other visitors have said they felt a female presence, or even seen her dressed in white while walking the cliffs alone, believed to be the ghost of a woman who threw herself over the cliffs many years ago. One man who tried to touch her lost all feeling in the right side of his body as he did. The cliff tops have also been the sightings of a rather angry-looking male spirit, storming his way along the path, looking for his wife and their lover who had run off together, as well as that of a large spectral hound off in the distance. Possibly the legendary hellhound of East Anglia, the Black Shuck, who has also been reported to be seen running around the ruins of Grey Friars nearby. Those who ventured down onto the beach have reported a figure, believed to be a sailor from the Elizabethan period, slowly walking out to sea or boarding a spectral boat before disappearing, with some saying he is searching for his long-lost love, and others believe he is answering the call of the bells. Others have also claimed to hear the laughter of disembodied children echoing along the beach when no one else is present. Away from the coast and the long-lost town, other places in the area are haunted by figures from the past. Around the ruins of Greyfriars, one of the last surviving elements of the old town, to the thick, dark woods on its border, spirits call these their home. The area around the ruins itself is haunted by at least 3 spirits. The hound, as mentioned before, a malformed shadow figure that lurks around a section that was once a leper colony, and that of a monk who walks what's once the walls, still checking up on the place he once called home. Sometimes it is reported that the spirits of his monastic brothers are with him, chanting and praying as they go. Those brave enough who have set out to walk the trails through the woods as the sun goes down have said they've heard a rider on a horse galloping towards them off in the distance. Showing no signs of stopping and fearing being trampled, they move to the side, but when the rider draws close, rather than a modern-day horseman, they see a Victorian gentleman on an Arab thoroughbred horse who vanishes soon after passing them. One of the more heartbreaking spirits that has been sighted is that of a rather sombre-looking young man who wanders the woods alone and vanishes when approached. Believed to be the brother of a local lord from Sotley Hall, located about 6 miles away, it is said he fell in love with a serving girl, but when he was forbidden from ever seeing her again, he died of a broken heart. It has been theorized that the 2 spirits in the woods may be connected to each other, with the one on the horse searching for his family member who ran off. Even the sounds of what are believed to have been the town's cattle can be heard grazing in the places that were once their fields. And, in the early 1900s, strange floating lights were seen at night that would appear to walkers shortly after their own lamps were mysteriously extinguished. These lights were said to try and lure their victims away from the safety of the path and towards the cliff's edge. Known locally as hobby lanterns, they bear a striking resemblance to the legends of the Will-o'-the-Wisps. And of course, what kind of haunted village is complete without a haunted pub? And Dunwich is certainly no exception, with the former landlady of the Ship Inn claiming to have been woken up in the middle of the night by a ghostly figure standing at the end of her bed that slowly backed up before melting through what appeared to be a solid wall. During renovation work years later, this apparent solid wall would be discovered to be not so solid after all, and was hiding a secret room that had not seen the outside world for hundreds of years. There should be no shock that Dunwich is considered one of the most haunted places in the area, and is popular with paranormal researchers and ghost hunting groups, who have made claims of hearing voices and seeing unexplained lights and figures, although all of these paranormal sightings could just easily be the inventions of locals over the centuries in a bid to get people to visit their once popular town and spend their money in the shops and pubs. Our final stop takes us to Breckles Hall, located in Norfolk, near the village of Breckles on the outskirts of Thetford Forest. The hall itself was built in 1583, and unlike the nearby village, still retains the original spelling of Breckles, with 2 C's rather than a CK. Over its life, it has hidden fugitive priests, played host to many notable figures from the country's history, from Elizabeth I to Winston Churchill, served as a decoy airfield in the Second World War, and even had one of its residents commit suicide in one of the bedrooms. But it is not the hall that interests us today, or in fact any of its inhabitants, as this apparition is said to only appear in the dead of night when the place is empty, and to see it could very well cost you your life. The story generally goes that it was in the depth of winter, nearing Christmas with the snow thick on the ground. A man named Jimmy Mace and his friends were drinking in the nearby pub. Jim Mace was far from a nice man. He is described as a drunk, a boaster, and a poacher with a violent streak. Not the kind of man you'd wish to find yourself on the wrong side of. After several drinks, the talk among the men soon turned to the nearby Breckles Hall and the large amount of well-fed partridges on the grounds, all ready for the Boxing Day shoot to take place in the upcoming days. And other than the old deaf gamekeeper, who would have long since gone to bed, the place stood empty, and with no one around to know they were there, who would miss a partridge or 12? They drank more for courage, to keep out the cold, and to kill time, to make sure the gamekeeper was definitely in bed. Finishing their drinks, Jim and one of his friends decided they would go and do it, but as they got up to leave, an elderly man who had been sitting nearby, unnoticed by the men, accosted them with a warning. "Now you listen to me, my boy. Just remember the coach and four." The men had heard the story of the ghostly carriage that comes to the nearby hall before, and brings misfortune to whoever sees it. But to them it was an old wives' tale. They laughed it off and left the pub. After stopping at Jim's cottage to collect his gun and a bag, they set off for the hall. Although drunk, Jim was still a very talented shot, and soon the bag was half full. They crept closer to the hall, looking for more game. Soon the building loomed into sight, pitch black and empty as they expected. Jim, possibly deciding he wanted to leave with more than just some stolen game for his troubles, led his friend up to the hall itself. Peering through the window, there was no sign of life, and the fires had clearly not been alight for some time. Keeping a lookout just in case, he urged his friend to try the door. The very moment his hand touched the handle, the distant sound of a clock striking midnight was heard. On the final stroke, a black carriage, pulled by 4 pitch-black horses, came through the entrance towards them. Its lamps burnt bright, and both the steps of the horses and the wheels made no sound. At the front sat a driver and 2 footmen, all motionless, staring forward unblinkingly, ignoring the 2 men in front of them. In a flash, the whole hall lit up and the doors flew open. Frozen in shock, Jim and his friend could only watch as the 2 footmen dismounted from the coach and opened the door. For a moment there was nothing inside the carriage, only a dark void. Then something began to move. Exiting from the carriage, helped by the footman, was an elegantly dressed woman in shining jewellery and an unearthly floating dress that clung to her. When she dismounted from the carriage, she raised her head and turned to look directly into the eyes of Jim Mace. Time seemed to slow, and all fell silent. The silence was broken by a deep, long howl mixed with a scream from Jim. The sound broke his friend from his trance. Terrified of what was happening to Jim, he ran away towards the village. He would go from door to door, trying to get help from the locals, but all who heard his story would refuse to go anywhere near the hall with the carriage around. It wouldn't be until the next morning that the village parson managed to persuade some locals to return to Breckles Hall. There was no sign of the woman, or the footman, or the carriage. In fact, there was no sign of anyone other than Jim and his friend had been there. No hoof or wheel marks. The fallen snow was still perfect on the ground other than their footprints. They found Jim Mace by the main door, laying on his back, looking up at the sky with his lifeless eyes, dead. His face was twisted into a horrible visage of a man who died in pure terror. Few would dare to look at him. A chilling tale to be sure, but like so many ghost stories of its type, it encounters the same problem. It's incredibly vague. It's always a story from the beginning of the last century, but which one? 20th, 19th, 18th? The friend who accompanied Jim Mace on his final night of poaching doesn't even seem to have a name in any of the versions I've found. The story also at times has major changes, with rather than a beautiful woman, it is the headless body of Anne Boleyn's father who is the passenger in the coach. I will finish by saying Breckles Hall is private property, so I would suggest no one goes there trying to see if they can find if this tale is true. You may not have a run-in with a ghost, but you may with a police officer or 2. What do you think of these tales of high strangeness? Are the fishermen of Sheringham right to fear the Yow-Yows? What do you think of the real Dunwich horrors? Do you think the phantom carriage still haunts Breckles Hall, waiting for its next victim? Do you have any similar stories from where you live? I'd like to hear about them. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Feel free to subscribe and like if you wish. This was a collection of local ghost stories, and although legends, they are a little bit of history.